My guest today on this special edition of the Sputnik will soon be the most famous Scotsman in the world, and you will thank me for this opportunity to understand the man, his times, and his work. He is the author of the recently premiered Kingsman, which is doing fantastic business as its predecessor did. He's written Flash, Spiderman, Superman. He even, at the age of 13, came up with the idea of what if Superman had landed on a Soviet collective farm rather than in the fields of Kansas? What if Superman, instead of building truth, justice, and the American way, had decided instead to back Stalin and the USSR? He's become a most unlikely Hollywood mogul. He's the only Hollywood mogul that doesn't own a smartphone, that picks his own children up from school, including today, so I better hurry. He's the only Hollywood mogul I know of who's a socialist, a Corbynist, a Brexiteer, and a practicing Roman Catholic. He's from Coatbridge, an Irish enclave just 10 miles from Glasgow. He comes from the same kind of milieu I come from myself, though he's been very much more successful. He's Mark Millar, and we're going to orbit Millarworld on the Sputnik today. Mark Millar, you look so young to have achieved so much. You're writing for young people. Are you just a big kid, really?
Do you know, I've always tried to avoid a job. I've tried to avoid growing up and having a job, and so far so good. I'm 47, and I've managed to avoid a job this far, so long may it continue.
Now, you started writing at the age of 6. You envisaged this Russian Superman at the age of 6.
Yeah.
That's phenomenal, surely.
Well, I don't know, it's something that seemed interesting to me. We're in a socialist household, you know, and I think I was suddenly aware of America and Russia at a very young age. And we had quite Russian sympathies, you know. I loved America, I love Americana, but at the same time, my parents were socialists. So I was kind of somewhere in the middle, being in Scotland. So for me, that idea of a Russian Superman seemed quite a natural one. And there was lots of American superheroes. Why not create a Russian one?
Why not, indeed. Now, you started submitting your work, presumably uncommissioned, to DC Comics, which I grew up on.
Yeah.
Tell us how you went from there.
Well, when I was 13, I remember writing a proposal for this Superman story, and I figured it took 5 days back then to send something from Scotland to New York, and then I figured the time difference, and I guessed the time that the editor would have it land on his desk, and he'd probably read it over lunchtime. So I planned to call at 8 p.m. that night and see what he thought of the story. And I was just like a lunatic. It was like one of these crazy X Factor contestants, you know. I phoned up the office and I said, "What did you think of the script I wrote?" And it's this kid's voice phoning him, you know. And he was saying, "I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to read this yet," you know. But they sent me a lovely rejection letter, which I still have, and it's about 6 pages long with lots of great advice, and I've adhered to that advice. Like, this guy had been in the business 40 years, you know, so he knew what he was talking about. And I sort of took that rejection as an affirmation in a weird way, because they took the time to write back to me, and it only encouraged me to keep going.
Now, you took one piece of advice, which was to stop drawing. You wanted to draw and write.
Yeah.
Tell us about the reason for ending that.
Well, it was a great advice. It was from another writer, a guy called Grant Morrison. He said to me, I said, "I want to be a writer and an artist," and he was doing the job I wanted to do. And he said, "It's very hard to be good at two things, to be really good at two things." He said, "It's like being a guitarist and being a physicist or something. You know, it's like two entirely different jobs." And I've just realised that's what Brian May does. He actually can do both, you know. Well, like, but it's very, very hard to have two skills that you maximise. And I had to make a decision. And I was so poor. I was a teenager. I had no money. I had no parents. I was living in a little bedsit. And I thought, I can't afford paper and ink and pencils and brushes, but I can afford, you know, my sister actually stole me newspaper paper out of her work, A4 paper, that I went to the local library and just used the typewriter in there and started sending submissions. And I used my student grant for stamps to send the stories in. Looking back, it's terrifying. It should never have worked, but it somehow worked out.
Now, you are from a large Catholic family, six children.
Yeah.
Your mother died when you were 14. Your dad died when you were still a teenager. And you had to drop out of Glasgow University because you literally had no money.
No bus fare? Yes.
No bus fare to the university. How has that held you back, or did it not hold you back?
I think actually in a weird way, and I hope my children don't watch this, but I think in a weird way, having nothing and dropping out of something actually was an amazing spur. Because I see my friends who say they wanted to be writers, but now they're in a job, you know, or they wanted to be musicians, but now they have a respectable job. And I think when you have a safety net, you know, you use it, don't you? You know, you're comfortable. And it can be very hard, you know, once you're in a system, it's very hard to drop out of it and do something unusual. But I kind of had no choice. I had to make a success of it, or I was going to starve to death, you know. So it really spurs you on. I mean, an empty stomach is a fantastic motivation for a writer. So I would spend 5 days a week, very motivated. Like I would be up at 7:30 and be writing at 9 o'clock, even though I had nobody to write for. I treated it like a job from when I was 19. Now,
I'm a man of faith. So are you. How important is faith to you?
I've never known not being a Catholic, you know, so we grew up in the belief system of our parents, and no matter what, it colours you for the rest of your life, you know, whether you're right-wing, left-wing, atheists, Jewish, Catholic, whatever, you know. And I've only had good experiences with it. Like being a Catholic, you know, we always see films about how terrible it is to be a Catholic and so on, but I only saw the positive. You know, for me, being a Catholic, you know, was just being part of a community, caring about other people. It informs my socialism, you know, the Christian side of it, which is that there's something more than the material world, I think is quite a good ethos. So I've always been very comfortable with Catholicism, and I never felt that rejection of it or the reaction against it, you know, that a lot of teenagers feel, because I never saw a downside. Like the priests were always good guys in their community, well thought of, guys who worked hard, didn't get any money for it, sacrificed their life for it, you know. So like, I saw that it's quite a heroic thing for me, really. You know?
Now, you nearly ruined your first communion. Tell us about that.
Well, I was so into Spiderman, and I didn't have a Spiderman costume. I tried to make my own. So I drew Spiderman's webs all over my face with a big ink marker, you know, was out playing at Spiderman with my pals, and then thought I could just wash this off, but like I couldn't. And I had my Holy Communion 7 days later, and you can still see it in the communion photographs. There's all these lovely kids wearing school uniform, and then there's a kid that looks like Spiderman standing in the middle of them all. You know?
Now, this must make you a very unusual bird in Hollywood. The Catholicism, the socialism, the poor background, I'm guessing. All of these are quite unusual.
Well, it's funny because you don't realise you're poor until you have something to compare it to. So when I did go to America, when I was working in New York for years, it is interesting. I realised I did grow up poor, but I was unaware of it because all my friends were the same. But like, but I would meet guys who would talk about being rags to riches stories, but they'd gone from, you know, their dad had 5 factories and they built that up to 12 factories. You know, that kind of thing. You know?
That's rags to riches.
But we genuinely had nothing. We didn't have a car. We didn't go foreign holidays. We lived in a council estate. My dad was made redundant when I was a young teenager. So like we had a proper, you know, sort of west of Scotland kind of experience. But I think what that does is a tremendous advantage because it makes you different from everybody else. One, you're not afraid of failure. Like I thrive on the idea of failure, you know. I like the idea of taking risks because I know what it's like to have nothing and it's not that scary. You know, I don't want to have nothing, but I know I can deal with it. Whereas if you're a guy who grows up rich, you're terrified and you do what you're told. So I've never, ever felt that obedience that these guys feel. So I think in a weird way, it toughens you and you feel you can handle anything.
Are you comfortable with the values of this kind of Justice League, the superheroes that our kids grow up on today?
Yeah.
I'm always slightly anxious, not least at the violence.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I tend to show my kids the old stuff. Like, I'll dig out Christopher Reeves or George Reeves shows. I'll get Linda Carter, Wonder Woman, Adam West, Batman. And my kids absolutely adore it. And I'll tell you, I've never taken my children to one of the DC movies like Superman, Batman or anything. It's too dark, you know? And I know what they're doing. They're looking for legitimacy. And it does tend to hit a certain amount of box office, but they're completely missing out on that younger age group that Marvel's cleaning up on. Marvel stuff tends to balance it pretty well, so young kids can still watch Spider-Man or whatever. They're not too dark for them. So the kind of things I tend to do tend to skew a little bit darker, but my kids, even my oldest kid who's 19, I didn't let her see Kick-Ass until she was 15. I waited until she was 15, you know, before she saw it. So she was furious. She had to wait years to see it.
Tell us about Kingsman. You said to me, I haven't yet watched it, to be honest, that this was a working class James Bond.
Yeah.
Tell us.
Well, I always kind of liked that idea of characters who are a bit like you in a movie, I think you identify with. And I don't think we identify with James Bond. He's a wish-fulfillment character. But Peter Parker and Clark Kent and so on, those are interfaces for the audience into something that's unreal, something real into something unreal. So you can relate to the secret identity. And James Bond doesn't have that. And that was the idea I'd always had. And I'm interested in, if you do a story about Britain, class inevitably comes into it in a way that you never think about that in American stories. But I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to have a working class guy in that very aristocratic environment where it's not even middle class, it's definitely a very lower upper class vibe, James Bond, Whitehall and MI5, MI6 and everything. And I thought it'd be pretty cool. Harry Palmer did that a little bit.
He did, I was going to say that.
And I wanted to take the silliness of a Roger Moore Bond, and sort of combine it with Ken Loach. Like that was the idea I had. It was the idea of the two Britons that America understands, like an international audience understands. They understand Ken Loach movies and they understand Roger Moore, James Bond, or Downton Abbey, that kind of thing. But we've never seen those worlds collide, and I don't think I've ever seen that before. I don't think I've ever seen the juxtaposition of those two things in a big mainstream movie. And that it gave it a flavour of its own, because you had a housing estate in the same movie. You saw like an underground lair in the Himalayas, So it was a very odd hybrid movie.
Now tell us about this Soviet Superman. When I first met you, this is the thing that captured my imagination. Tell us.
There's something just quite exciting about it. I love reversals, stories that flip something on its head. And I like something that's an icon being flipped. It's always kind of interesting to write those kind of stories, like James Bond, who's an aristo, making him a working class kid, that kind of thing, flipping it, or kicking Spiderman but having no superpowers, So I find that quite fun. So like Superman for me is the ultimate American icon. So to flip it and make it the ultimate Soviet icon, the story kind of wrote itself. So instead of Superman's rocket landing in a Kansas wheat field, like you see, it lands in a collective farm. The idea of, instead of growing up believing in truth, justice, and the American way, it's the glorious 5-year plan. So the story unfolds beautifully. And then there was a lovely coincidence, which is that Stalin translates as Man of Steel, which is Superman's nickname. And there was just all these little things kind of right in
itself. And the S could stand for Soviet.
And a hammer and sickle in his...
Could you make a film of that, Mark?
Well, funnily enough, there's a friend of mine who's a director called Timur Bekmambetov, who made Wanted, the first movie that I was involved in myself. And he said to me, I wish you hadn't done that as a DC comic. If you just made it your own character, we could have done it as a movie. But like DC, unfortunately, they own the rights. But weirdly, a few director friends have said to me that the Warner Brothers have approached them and asked for a take on Red Sun as a movie. So I don't know, I think right now, Russia's never been sort of more interesting than it is at the moment, So there's an international audience,
President Putin could play Superman.
He could fund it.
Well, if he's watching, maybe he will. Now, in the second half of the show, I want to talk to you about your political views.
Yeah.
Try and encourage you to have some political ambitions, because I've certainly got them for you. So we're going to talk about another Superman, Jeremy Corbyn. Okay. He's turned out to be a man of steel, that's for sure. Stay tuned to the Sputnik. Welcome back to Sputnik. I'm interviewing Superman, or the next best thing. He's a Renaissance man, or whatever they call them in Coatbridge. He's a man of many parts. One of them is the Hollywood mogul we've just been talking about. The other is a socialist and supporter of our very own Superman, Jeremy Corbyn. Mark Millar is our guest. Mark, that must be unique in Hollywood. I mean, not having a smartphone, picking your own kids up from school, being a practicing Catholic, these are all unusual features in Hollywood, I'm sure. But being a supporter of Jeremy Corbyn has to be something unique. Tell us about that.
I love the whole Corbyn story. I love what's happened here. There's a tortoise and the hare thing with him and Blair that I love. I love the fact that they both entered Parliament in 1983 in the same day. And, Blair got there first, like he got to be Prime Minister, but by the time he was disgraced, Corbyn was just getting the winds behind him. And there's something lovely about that just by staying true to your principles and always saying what you believe, and even if it's unfashionable for decades, literally decades, you win in the end, And I think Corbyn's going to be a very old man feeling happier about his career, I think, than Blair. I think Blair must already look back with some regret, no matter how rich he is or however many people he plays tennis with that he admires, you know, like...
Well, he does have a haunted look compared to Corbyn, doesn't he?
Corbyn's content. I think Corbyn's...
Serene.
Yeah, and it's there's a zen-like calm, and I think there's an inner steel in Corbyn, I think, you know, that Blair, there's no steel. I think he will just go wherever the cash is, or, you know, as he moved from Clinton to Bush, you know, like he no matter who was going to win that election, he would have been the first on a plane to congratulate him. Whereas Corbyn he's never lied, I feel, you know, I'm sure he has on some level, but I feel as if...
I've never known him to lie, and I've known him for more than 40 years.
I feel as if it does what it says in the tin with Corbyn, and I think there's a great message there for everybody as well. And I think if you're going to admire politicians, admire the conviction politicians, not the ones that bend to whatever is fashionable.
Now, once upon a time, what you've just said would have been a commonplace amongst the Irish Catholic immigrant community in Scotland, of which we're both a part. But that's changed rather dramatically. To my astonishment, frankly. A majority of Scottish Catholics voted for Scottish independence in recent years. Why did you not go down that road?
I did briefly, actually, I did, because it was very alluring. You know, I think when you looked at Scottish Labour, if you looked at the Labour Party in general, but Scottish Labour in particular, it was a nest of vipers, you know, it was a bunch of guys you didn't agree with. So we looked for an alternative, and there's people I like Tommy Sheridan, so, and I voted for the Scottish Socialist Party. And the SNP, I think, spotted a gap in the market. They realised their ultimate ambition is to separate Scotland from the rest of the UK, and by whatever means necessary, and they realised, hang on, there's a gap in the market here, we can possibly make this work for us, in the same way that in the 1960s they pretended they were Alec Douglas Hume, you know, when they were the Tartan Tories, you know, like... But ultimately, all they really believe in is separation. They don't really have any other, I think, principle outside of that. And there's some very good people in there. I don't mean that in a bad way, but I think I was taken in by the new rhetoric. But then when I looked at it up closely, I was seeing council tax freezes and so on. And what Thatcher was doing in the GLC 30 years ago, you know, and when you really look closely at it, a lot of it was very superficial, and it wasn't really as socialist and progressive as it looked. But I can see the attraction. But it's one of those things now that the real deal has emerged. You know, we have Richard Leonard now in charge of Scottish Labour, which is very exciting, because I'm a great believer...
Now, let's talk about him, because he's your friend as well as mine, but most of the viewers will not know who Richard Leonard is. Talk us through that.
Well, it's very interesting because Scotland traditionally is associated with the left and England's slightly more centrist or right. But we had a very interesting thing at the last election, which was that Scotland actually veered very slightly to the right and the rest of the country went to the left. And that just shows you how odd the Labour Party really has been perceived in Scotland. And it's because there's been a lot of right-wing people who've been running it for 2 or 3 decades now. So a new candidate has emerged, you know, who has been described as Corbyn's man. I don't know how true that is, but he's certainly a left-wing candidate, a guy called Richard Leonard, who's an ex-GMB union guy, who I've a huge amount of time for. I've never heard a bad word about. My brother knows him personally very well. And it's just very exciting. It's the kind of guy that, you know, we would believe in, you know, we would vote for, who's in charge of Scottish Labour, which in my adult lifetime has never actually happened.
It's going to be a test, though, because he is English-born. He speaks with an English accent. It'll be a test, not just for him, but for the Scottish people, and indeed for the so-called civic nationalists, whether they will seek to exploit that. You confident that Scottish people will take to Richard? I am, but I'd like validation from you on that.
Do you know, I think they will, in the sense that I think it's actually a genius move having an English guy in charge of Scottish Labour, because, well, he's lived in Scotland for most of his life. He's married to a Scottish woman, you know, since he was at university. But but I think it's going to be very hard for nationalists to say we don't like this guy because he's English, when they've been trying to say otherwise for the last 30 years. You know, if they're trying to say that they're not racist, it's going to be very hard to attack a man based on his race and where he was born. So.
Indeed. Now, because you're a socialist, and I think because also you're a Catholic, you haven't forgotten, in fact, you still live there, you haven't forgotten the place from which you come, and you're determined to put what you can back into the community that made you. Tell us about that.
Well, I've never really lost touch with where I was born. I grew up in a place called Coatbridge, which is a steel town in the west of Scotland, and I've made the journey to Glasgow, which is 10 miles. And I remember my sister crying when I left Coatbridge. I was 31, and I moved 10 miles to Glasgow, and she said, "We're never going to see you again," you know. And I was like, "You work in Glasgow? I'm like 20 minutes away. It's not bad." But Coatbridge has always been a very powerful place for me. It's like, you know, where most of my family still live, where all my cousins are and everything, you know, and a lot of my friends, like a lot of my school friends are living in Coatbridge or surrounding areas. So it's a place I've got huge affiliation to, and I go back to it a lot. I'd say I'm probably in Coatbridge once a week. So I know the pubs well, I know the restaurants well, you know, I'm never out of the place. And you know, I do think it's kind of important. You have a debt to the place you grew up in. Like the school, for example, where I went, my old primary school, that's where I learned how to read and write. You know, so that's a big thing for a writer. You know, like you owe those guys big time if they taught you how to open up a book and start writing or how to read. So I always felt it's your responsibility not to pull the ladder up behind you, you know. So I guess it's socialism, but I think it's just basic decency. I've done extremely well, much better than I ever expected I could possibly do. So I would like to, in some way, help the area I grew up in, and I came up with a plan. I came up with a plan for it.
Tell us.
Well, very simply, you know, my wife and I had talked about a donation. Like, we sold our company quite recently to Netflix, but we knew this had been on the cards for a year or two. And I had this idea of, you know, maybe making a donation to the area. And it's a relatively small area. The housing estate I grew up in is 1,000 houses, 6,000 people, 5 shops, a church, 2 churches, and 2 schools, 2 primary schools. So it's small, you know, it's relatively small, but it's seen a lot of social migration and so on over the years. And, you know, councils being what it is, there's not a lot of money around, you know, so it's seen a lot of deprivation too. And there's a lot of kind of sites that aren't as pretty as they should be and so on. So instead of making a donation, I just suddenly thought, well, what if I actually, you know, I've got a reasonable amount of business acumen, you know, so what if I actually take over some of these derelict sites that aren't so pretty and put houses on them? And instead of a donation, I build houses. And then with the profits from those houses, you know, which you can almost double your money, put that into the community and then take the initial capital that I used to build those houses and build more houses. So you have this amazing double effect where what I'm doing is I'm prettifying the area. I'm taking the areas that don't look so good in it, the wasteland and so on, putting something nice there, bringing some money into the community, and then the profits from that housing scheme go into the schools and the churches.
You know that Robert Owen in New Lanark, who was one of Britain's original socialists, he created a kind of model village and sought, it was a failure, it has to be said, but he sought to grow a community around his socialist values.
Yeah.
Is that the kind of thing you've got in mind?
I think I'm genuinely...
Is that too ambitious?
I think my plan is like to let people do their own thing, but to try and encourage people to move into the area for one thing. Because I'll give you an example. When I was at school, there was over 500 kids in the school, and the numbers eventually went down to about 140, but there's fantastic head teachers in the schools now. The reputation in the school is great, so there's now over 200 kids, for example, in the school I went to. But I'd love that to grow more. You know, I'd love to just bring families back in, because the social migration meant that a lot of young families moved out and old people stayed behind. So I'd like to get more young families back in there. But let people do their own thing, but just make it an attractive place to live. So I would want to live in a community where the local churches and the local schools had lots of money that other schools don't have. So I just want to provide them with that cash. So I want the after-school clubs to be as good as the private school clubs that are out there and everything. I want I don't think it's fair that if you're born in a certain community, you don't have as nice a life as kids in another community. So I want to redress that balance just personally. And you can do it with cash.
Well, in the borough we live in London, poor people died 22 years before the wealthiest people in the borough. So it's a tale of 2 cities everywhere. Just lastly, in the last couple of minutes, what's next for you? You're now at Netflix. They bought your company.
Yeah.
Are you now running the company that bought your company? What's the next 5 years of your career?
Well, my wife and I actually, we sold the company just a few months back, and we signed a deal where we've come on as president and CEO of Millarworld, which is the company we used to run, but is now within Netflix. It was Netflix's first ever acquisition, and they've no plans to buy anything else, you know, so it's just us. But we have our own department, and we run our own show, and they are fantastic. And it's funny, every time I do an interview talking about Netflix, it's like I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. I do love it, but it really is great. You know, like I've worked in the Hollywood system for a long time, and I see it's based on cowardice and it's based on people worried about their jobs and everything, you know, and it's, the studios have been around a long time and they feel that they're tottering. They're spending 400 or 500 million on some of these big movies and they're terrified of the box office returns. Netflix has got the most interesting model. You know, they're bringing in $1 billion a month, you know, from their subscriptions, and they're trying to do interesting things with it. You know, an average studio does 28 hours of material every year. Netflix is doing 1,600 hours of original material next year. So it's like, from a creative point of view, it's really exciting. They said to me, you know, we want to take risks and we want to see some failures, because failure means that you've tried something new. And I was like, I'll give you failures. I'll see if I can give you some failures. You know, so we'll see what
I've got a couple in my pocket here I can sell you. Is it sunset for Hollywood? Its reputation has never been lower.
Yeah.
And as you've just described it, it's hardly a paragon of creative and intelligence-based risk-taking.
Yeah.
Is it over for Hollywood?
One thing I've learned in life is things are never over. If we look back at history, there's just periods of change. And it's like socialism. You know, in 1997, we'd have thought we're never going to see Jeremy Corbyn as Prime Minister. But things are cyclical. And what happens with Hollywood, it's been around for 100 years, but it was in big trouble in the 50s with television, big trouble in the 80s with video, it's in big trouble now with streaming. But Hollywood adapts. It's an animal that is worth a lot of money and makes a lot of money, so it's very clever, and it finds a way of adapting, and it'll come back as something else.
Mark Millar, you're my Superman. Thanks for joining us
Thanks for
on the
having me.
Sputnik. That was Mark Millar, MBE. I've been George Galloway, and you've been marvellous.